Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable titled Exploring Maura Laverty. I'm glad to see so many people here, many familiar faces as well, so that's really great. If things are correct, you should now be able to see my screen as well in an attempt to introduce this roundtable discussion. And as you will be seeing in a moment, we actually have a wonderful lineup, I think, to discuss Maura Laverty, this key figure in not only Irish theatre history, but in Irish society in a broader sense as well. And while I'm saying key figure, now what I think we must also observe in starting this discussion is that she has only received very limited recognition for her many contributions. And this roundtable is one step towards redressing this. But the people who make up this roundtable have already done a lot of great work in paving the way towards that recognition. And I'll show you their names in a moment. Those are Bairbre and Cathy, who unfortunately cannot join us today herself, but she has a wonderful video clip that I'll tell you more about in a little moment as well. It's Caitrionia, Cathy, Leaney, and Deirdre McFeely. So what they'll be doing is giving us short presentations, and afterwards I'll be keen to open up the floor for a general discussion in which you can ask questions, and I'll try to moderate that as best I can. Now, before we move to Barbara's video clip, who has indeed provided us with something really great about a play that she has produced herself and also acted in herself. She can't be herself today, unfortunately, but we'll be watching that about 5-minute clip in a moment. What I thought I'd do is share just one or two initial observations regarding Maura Laverty, just to set the scene a little bit. I'd like to do that with particular reference to, indeed, her, I feel, unacknowledged importance and also her, I think, symptomatic marginalization as a woman writer. I think that's very much informs that situation as well. So just a few, oh yeah, and of course I am the chair here, but that's much less important than the presenters. Now, what she might be most famous with you for is her Dublin Trilogy. So the 3 plays Maura Laverty wrote for the Gate Theatre in the early 1950s. So Liffey Lane, Talker Row, and A Tree in the Crescent. And apart from their quality as plays, what we should also very much recognize is that these were really plays that saved the Gate financially in the early 50s, and had Maura Laverty not contributed those to the Gates, well, it might have been a theatre lost to history by now rather than still existing. So that is something that I think she only received some partial recognition for, and that we might want to highlight once again in talking about her. Just a very small fun fact of trivia, namely that in A Tree in the Crescent, so the final play in the trilogy, actually starts Carol O'Connor, who would go on to play the role of Archie Bunker in All in the Family. So that's also, his career started more or less at the Gate in Maura Laverty's plays. But something of a more serious note that I'd like to highlight here, Christopher Fitzsimon in his biography, The Boys, and I'm sure many of you will know of his biography of Edwards and MacLeamore. He observes already there that Laverty, despite indeed being more or less responsible for saving the Gate in the 1950s, actually had many difficulties in getting Edwards and MacLeamore to pay the royalties that were due to her. And she constantly had to write letters and letters and try to kind of cajole them into giving her actually the money she had a right to. So I think, again, this is symptomatic of her position as a woman writer as well, that she didn't really get, not even in a literal sense, the credit that was due to her. And in a related vein, and it's the kind of final thing I want to share with you today, because I think it's also a wonderful expression of her personality, an anecdote that Christopher Fitzsimon also relates, namely that in later years, when Hilton Edwards became head of drama at RTE, so the Broadcast Corporation, these problems persisted. So at one stage, and you can read the quote by Fitzsimon here, Maura Laverty submitted a number of ideas for a television play at Hilton's request, and he was greatly taken by one of these and wrote saying they were going to produce it and there would be a check in the post. And a few days later, he wrote again to say that he was at this stage much dependent on the views of my editors, who have more television wisdom than myself. And that meant to say that he wasn't able, after all, to commission that play for her for unclear reasons, even though he had committed to that already. And again, it's symptomatic, but I also want to share Maura Laverty's response to Hilton Networks, because I think it channels an energy that some of us perhaps also sometimes want or should want to express. It's a very short reply that she gave to him, but a very telling one. Dear Hilton, if your script editors know so much more about television than you do, why are you employed as head of television drama? So on that note, I think we'll leave the kind of bandwidth that we have here at that for now. And I'd like to move to the first element of our roundtable. As I said, Bairbre unfortunately cannot be here, but I'd like to introduce her very much nevertheless because she has a wonderful video to show us. She's an actor and director with a very wide range of experience at the Gate, at the Abbey, at Ruud, with Anu Productions, other stages as well. She's received very many accolades for her work, including the Irish Times Judges Special Awards in 2008. She was also an associate artist at the Abbey for 3 years and artistic director at Calypso Productions. And recently she played the role of Maura Laverty in a great production that she created with Yvonne Quinn, titled This Was Your Life, directed by Joan Sheehy. And it offers a wonderful reflection on Maura Laverty's role in Irish society, but also how that impacted her personal life. So rather than say more about it, let's watch that video, which Sarah, who is coordinating the technicalities today and tomorrow, will be able to launch for us, I think. So that was, I think, absolutely wonderful to see, not just the contents and the complexity of her public life and her private life and how those intersect in this production, but also the enthusiastic responses by various audiences. So yeah, unfortunately, again, Bairbre can't be here today, but I think that we've been able to see this video of that production is already wonderful. Let's now move on to the three panelists who we do have with us today. We'll take questions at the very end, as we've been doing in the other sessions as well, and also be introducing them in turn. And the first person that I'd like to introduce is Caitriona Clare, who's a senior lecturer in the history department at NUIG. She's published monographs and articles on a wide range of topics from both 19th and 20th century history, including nuns, women's household work, oral history, women's magazines, vagrancy, and of course, Maura Laverty. Today she'll share with us a brief biographical sketch of Maura Laverty and then discuss her attitude to religion in her novels and poems. I'd say to Caitriona, take it away.
Thanks, Ruud. And I just want to say, having seen Barbara's brilliant play last February 29th, it really got across to me a whole new. I've been looking at Maura Laverty since I've been interested in her for about 35 years, and I've been studying her and looking at her papers for about the past 20 years. And Barbara's play gave me a whole new view of her. Anyway, let's get going. Now, a few things about Maura Laverty that struck me. Just to start off as a kind of an introduction, contemporary debates on historical abuses, I suppose, can sometimes lead us to assemble the people of the past from a flat pack of beliefs and attitudes we think everybody must have held in those days. So it's challenging to come across a historical figure like Maura Laverty, playwright, journalist, broadcaster, novelist, children's writer, cookery writer, agony aunt, beauty expert. A woman whose attachment to Catholicism, that's what I want to talk about today, was strong and deep and lifelong, but whose views and opinions were anything but predictable. So I'm going to give a brief biography of Laverty and then talk about religion. Right. Now, Maura Kelly, Kelly was her maiden name, was born in Rathangan, County Kildare in 1907, the third eldest of 9 children. Her mother had a drapery shop. Her beloved father, whose gambling habit at the nearby Curra racecourse nearly destroyed the family, he died in 1920. Maura went boarding to the Brigidine convent in Tolo, County Carlow, and one of the nuns there used her contacts to get Maura a job in Spain as a governess, which was a common enough thing for Irish middle-class girls at the time. So off she went at the age of 17 in 1924. She didn't last long at the governessing, she was too lively. And she went and worked at a series of secretarial jobs where she met lots of friends and got engaged to a Hungarian engineer. And what was meant to be her last visit home before her wedding in 1928, she met Chaomih Laverty, to whom she'd been writing while she was in Spain. They married almost immediately in November 1928. Now, Maura Kelly was already a successful earning journalist and writer by the time she got married. She'd been sending home articles from Spain, articles about Ireland, poems, stories about Ireland and about Spain for magazines and newspapers. So it's probably no surprise to us really that the newly married Maura Laverty had her own radio programme on 2RN, the national radio station, from 1929. On her literary programme in the 1930s, she interviewed a lot of prominent figures, including T.S. Eliot. She worked on the Irish women's magazine Women's Life, as agony aunt Mrs. Wise, and as beauty expert Delia Dixon, and as the doctor Gary Myers. This is according to her daughter Barry Castle, when I met her. In 1941, she wrote a government-sponsored cookery book, Flour Economy. Her first novel, Never No More, The Story of a Lost Village, was published like all her it was published by Longmans Green, like all her novels. It came out in 1942. Now, it was a fictionalized memoir of a rural past, and this was a very important, very popular genre in Britain at that time. If you only want to think about The Country Child by Alison Utley in 1931, The Farm by Lochgore by Mary Carberry in 1933. I know it's about Ireland, but it was really aimed at a British audience and written by an English woman. And the Lark Rise to Candleford books that came out in the early 1940s by Flora Thompson. Never No More was pretty mainstream in that sense for an English-speaking audience. And it's based on the life and the background of the real Maura Kelly. The following year, she brought out a novel called Alone We Embark, which wasn't a fictionalized memoir. It was banned. Never No More wasn't banned. Alone We Embark was banned. No More Than Human, which appeared in 1944 and continued the Maura Kelly story. Delia Scully was her alter ego in Never No More, and she in No More Than Human goes to Spain, and it's a fantastic book about her time in Spain. That wasn't banned either. But the novel she brought out in 1946, Lift Up Your Gates, which was set in Dublin's inner city, was banned. So she had 2 banned and 2 not banned. In this decade, she also published her second cookery book, which I know is Kind Cooking, but which somebody else calls Maura Laverty's cookery book. The edition I have is from the 1940s, and it's got illustrations by Louis Le Brocquet. You can see them there. She also, in the same year, 1946, she published a novel called The Cottage in the Bog, a children's book. Laverty's 4 novels were read all over the English-speaking world and were rapturously reviewed, and they went into several editions. The Never No More I have with me here at home is the 7th printing of it. In the 1950s, as we know, she was a playwright and so on. Her classic cookery book, Full and Plenty, appeared in 1960. And up to her sudden death in 1966, she contributed to an almost untrackable number of radio programs, newspapers, and magazines. She crops up everywhere. As far as a journalist, she was in no way marginal. And this comes across in Seamus Kelly's wonderful biography of her, The Maura Laverty Story. But she was marginal in some ways. Now, I'm going to talk about religion. There is evidence that she became estranged from the institutional church in the 1950s, that she fell away. Her sister Conleth, now deceased, more or less told me that. She said Maura was very religious, although she didn't go to Mass every Sunday, and she had her troubles with the church. But she remained a believer all her life. In the 1930s and 40s, she was, however, quite a conventional Catholic. She wrote 2 booklets for the Catholic Truth Society of Ireland in the 1930s, one about St. Patrick and a little novella called The Prodigal Daughter, which, like a lot of novellas at the time, was about a girl who goes to the city and comes back to the country where she really belongs. In the 1930s also, Seamus Kelly's book tells us she had a radio program called From the Manger to the Cross, which was building on the Eucharistic Congress and was all about religious themes. Now, in No More Than Human, her novel about Spain, she would suggest that she had been converted to the Republican politics of Spain when she was there in the 1920s. That was in 1943. But in the 1930s, she was writing and broadcasting opinions that were very much on the Franco side of the Spanish Civil War divide, saying that the church had always been a great support to Spain and so on. Well, she could have changed her views in hindsight. And she was a founding member of Clon na Poblach, Sean McBride's kind of left-wing nationalist party in 1947-48. So I don't want to talk about her politics though so much. I want to talk about her belief in Catholic ritual and sacrament and so on. In the Delia Scully books, that is Never No More and No More Than Human, she slips in a few of the poems she wrote as a young woman on religious themes. And there's one and comes up in Never No More. It's about the reverence that's due to a wheat field because of its association with the Blessed Sacrament. And she reproduces this again in Full and Plenty in 1960. I'll just read a little bit of it. Walk softly, O man, past an acre of wheat, O birds, mute your silver-splashed mirth. "O breeze, hold your breathing. O sun, shed your heat. For here is the food that God gave us to eat. The body of Christ comes from sanctified wheat. Twice blessed be this fruit of the earth." So she still thought enough of it in 1960 to put it into full and plenty. There's another poem that she wrote when she was a girl, actually, and she includes it in Never No More. And it's about the Holy Family's flight into Egypt. And it's addressed to Saint Joseph, leaving his workshop. "Lonesome your thoughts when you stood at the door with the tools in your hand. Your glance lingered long on the pile of new wood for the work you had planned. Bitter it was to start out in the night for a man of your years, to look back from the top of the hill at your home with your eyes full of tears." Very much an imaginative association there with the life of Saint Joseph. And then there's one about encountering Our Lady sewing on Dunmurry Hill in County Kildare. And it's quite a kind of a mystical poem. It would nearly give you beautiful colours in it. I'll just read a little bit of that as well. "As I walked over blue Dunmurry Hill, knee-deep in young things growing, I came upon a lady dressed in white on the hillside sewing, white dress, gold gorse, and blue and purple heather, and a glad lady stitching in the April weather." And it goes on and it gets darker and darker, but with loads of different colours in it, kind of iridescent, beautifully written as it goes on. And then there's a nice kind of one for children that's in The Cottage in the Bog. And it's in the voice of an Irish child, and it imagines what it would have been like if Jesus had been born in Ireland. "The sport we would have were you with us again, and choose for your birthplace a cottage in Shane. It's jumping the bog holes together we'd be, and eating the hot griddle bread hot for our tea, and out with the rod after perches and eels, and getting a ride on the top of the creels. I'd show you the nest I found down the hill, where the mother bird hatches so happy and still. Ah, little Lord Jesus, if you came again, would you choose for your birthplace a cottage in Shane?" Shane is a townland near Rathangan. Now, in the novels, just to get away from the poems for the moment, there is really deep reverence for religion. Delia in No More Than Human is genuinely upset when she's accused by a malicious fellow governess of flirting with her boyfriend using holy water in the porch of a church. She's really quite upset by this. The children in Alone We Embark, the banned book, break off their games matter-of-factly to say the Angelus in the fields at noon. Receiving Holy Communion gives Chrissy, the central character in Lift Up Your Gates, also banned. It gives her the singing feeling, and Billy the Tramp in this novel regularly invokes biblical references. Sister Martha, a sister of charity in the same novel who runs a penny dinner house, is a fount of wisdom and goodness, and to a great extent the moral centre of the novel. Now, there is anti-clericalism in it, directed at the pomposity and greed of priests. Jim Sweeney, the communist, a sympathetic character in Lift Up Your Gates, fulminates against slum landlords who turn their sons into, quote, pot-bellied parish priests, end quote. In Never No More, which wasn't banned, the priest is an aloof and patrician figure. When his horse has the toothache, he requisitions some spuds from Mick, one of his parishioners, and I quote, "You could bring them into me, say, a stone or two, sometime tomorrow. You know the kind of potatoes I want. Those large, ordinary ones. You have plenty of them, I'm sure." Mick was silent for a second. "I have, your reverence," he said, "but I've plenty of those large, ordinary children to eat them. Good day to you," end quote. But this kind of story was very common among devout Catholics in the 20th century. And if Laverty was banned, it wasn't, anyway, this book wasn't banned, but this kind of a story. Similar stories also appear in unbanned fiction in the 1940s by Francis McManus, Patrick Purcell, and Mary Lavin, among others. So it wasn't anti-clericalism, but I think attacking or questioning the rituals and liturgies of religion would have been something else. Now, it's an interesting thing that all of Laverty's novels, they were all very well reviewed worldwide. She wasn't that liked in Ireland because I think it was a little bit too close to the life that a lot of Irish people were still living and didn't like to see sort of rural backwardness, particularly the rural novels, on display. But the Catholic press in particular, worldwide, loved her books. An American Catholic reviewer in The Sign said that Alone We Embark, which was called Touched by the Thorn in America, which was banned in Ireland, he described it as, quote, "as wholesome as homemade bread," end quote. The American Jesuit periodical America praised No More Than Human to the skies. Now, No More Than Human wasn't banned, but it wasn't that popular either. Lift Up Your Gates, which was banned, the novel about the inner city, was praised unreservedly by W.J. Igoe in the British Catholic Herald. Absolutely, really rapturous review. I've always believed that it was Laverty's earthiness about the body which led to 2 of her novels being banned in Ireland and maybe the other 2 not being as popular as they should be. But I'm wondering now if there was also an unease about a female secular writer writing on spiritual themes at a time when lay organisations which claimed religious inspiration, like, for example, the rural-based Marginality or the Urban Legion of Mary, these were lay organisations and they were sometimes suppressed by bishops or at least questioned by bishops. But like then again, those religious poems feature in the unbanned books. And anyway, recent scholarship by, among others, Sheila de Clare and Cara DeLay argue that religious ritual and devotion in 20th century Ireland were very important imaginatively and culturally, particularly for women. And both historians explore the creativity and the joy that women experienced in the practice and elaboration of such ritual. So this joy comes across in Maura Laverty's poems, and her imaginative engagement with Bible stories, with sacraments and so on, inspires some of her finest writing, I think. And her reverence for Catholicism or for religion, if not always for its ministers, is sort of a complex part of her makeup, because as Bairbre Queeve's play shows, she was also a very cosmopolitan character. But I think that if we understand her attitude to religion and her belief system there, the complexity of it, it deepens our understanding both of Laverty herself and of Catholicism in 20th century Ireland. If we want to know why people were so attached to Catholicism, we have to actually go there and find out why somebody like Laverty, you know, what it meant to her. Okay, I leave it there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Caitriona. I think there's the wonderful embedding of Maura Laverty in that period in Irish history, which shows her both to be a kind of exemplar of that period, as well as showing the kind of idiosyncrasies that she also very much embodies. So thanks so much for that. I'm sure people will have more questions for you about that later. But as I said, let's leave those until the end for now. Which means that for the moment we move on to Cathy Leeney, who's an adjunct lecturer in drama studies at University College Dublin. And for the past 2 years, she's been working on Maura Laverty in collaboration with Deirdre and McFeely, who's also here. And what's actually very exciting about that is that they are currently preparing to publish Maura Laverty's Dublin Trilogy with Liverpool University Press. So that's forthcoming shortly. Cathy is also co-editing an exciting collection of essays titled Analysing Gender in Performance. She's doing that with Paul Holferty, and that will appear from Palgrave Macmillan by the end of this year. What she'll be talking about in a moment is some issues around Laverty's choices of what to write about and to dramatise, relating particular aspects of life in 1950s Dublin and 1950s Ireland, but also what she chose to omit from that and not to engage with. And in addition, Cathy will also be posing some questions about Laverty's position in mid-20th century Irish theatre. So Cathy, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Ruud, and thank you very much for the GATE network for making this roundtable possible. It's a terrific opportunity to talk about Laverty, and Caitriona's comments about Laverty and her complex relationship with the Catholic Church certainly relates in important ways, I hope anyway, to what I have to say today, which is really about 2 questions. And the first question that I was asking myself is, what did Laverty choose to write about, as Ruud has said, and what did she leave outside the theatrical frame? And then further, to think about how a play, how one of Laverty's plays might itself complicate that question of what is within or without the frame. So I'm going to use the example of the first play in Laverty's Dublin Trilogy, Liffey Lane, which was based on her 1946 banned novel, Lift Up Your Gates. This idea of looking at work in terms of what's within and what's outside the frame of what is given to be seen, or in this case heard as well, has been very expertly elaborated by Jill Dolan. And I think it may be applied to the context of 1950s Ireland, where censorship of publications of all kinds were common, and where the theatre, although it wasn't open to the disapproval of a Lord Chamberlain as happened in the UK, it was closely controlled through the self-censorship, which was internalized by some writers and by many theatre managers and producers. The limits of what could be inside the frame was set overwhelmingly by the discourses of the Catholic Church, discourses of misogyny and the mistrustful paranoia that's characteristic of those who are obsessed with power and control. So my question, I suppose, is how might Liffey Lane deal with that constraining frame? Does the play point towards what is beyond or below its narrative and particularly its ending? Laverty risked writing about the lives of those who were particularly vulnerable to the social authority of the Catholic Church: women, the poor, the needy, those who have transgressed the unforgiving norms of behavior at that time, and those who are simply unlucky in life. What the playwright shows us in Liffey Lane is systemic poverty and everything that follows from that: lack of work opportunities, educational opportunities, low self-esteem, low expectations of life, mothers struggling to feed their families, men and women escaping into drunkenness, ragged children, overcrowding and unsanitary living conditions. All of these issues were highly current at the time, and the play confronts the audience with the difficult reality, which may have been one of the reasons that the novel on which it was based was banned. But the two major plot lines of the play immediately foreground mothers and babies whose connection is not sanctioned by marriage. And this is a very current subject, obviously, just now for us all in this 2021 moment. In Liffey Lane, Bridie's child was born outside marriage and died tragically while still in infancy. The question that the play poses is, will Bridie's whole life be blighted by the stigma gossiped by vindictive neighbours? And in this connection, think of Mary in Juno and the Paycock as an example or a parallel. Kevin is a young boy in the play whose mother leaves him behind when she escapes her indiscretion to England. He's cared for by the Doyle family, his aunt and two cousins. But the Doyles must abandon Kevin to an orphanage so that they can take up an offer of affordable accommodation in a situation where they're threatened with homelessness. Social prejudice against the very presence in public space of such a child as Kevin is very obliquely dramatized in Liffey Lane through the heroine Chrissy's relationship with her little cousin and through the narrative of housing crisis and lack of money. Laverty shows us the often heroic struggles of those trapped in the squalor of Liffey Lane and their desperate attempts to escape, whether it's through gambling, alcohol, daydreams of Hollywood glamour, employment in the cleanliness and order of the local convent. But does the play offer the audience an understanding of why life is like this? What are the forces that generate the pressures suffered? The opening scene of the, which is a prologue to Liffey Lane, is worth mentioning in this regard, I think. Billy, who was played by Michael McLeamore, is a vagrant but educated and sympathetic figure who moves through all of the action of the piece as a kind of chorus leader and rapporteur. The strength of his stage presence is reflected by the casting of McLeamore in the part. It's the way that Billy opens the play that's really quite remarkable. with all the authority of Holy Scripture sonorously quoted from the Bible, Billy calls forth each individual character from the interior of the tenement house that they share. It is almost as if he is giving life to them. Each person steps out before the audience and speaks directly and intimately to us. The language and the ritual action of the scene together make an image of the two pillars of authority that are in control, the discourse of the church and the material conditions that entrap the poor. These two combine and threaten to dominate not only each individual's circumstances, but also their inner life and thoughts and the conversations each has within their own heads. What Laverty does not show us is Kevin, the child himself, whose very existence flew in the face of social acceptability. We never see him on the stage, and yet Chrissy's unconditional love for the boy and worry for his welfare, her extreme distress when she feels that she's losing him to confinement in an orphanage, Chrissy's is the emotional engine of the play. Mention in Liffey Lane of the inescapable orphanage is enough to make the blood of a 2021 audience freeze. But the play wrong foots us in our contemporary moment. Kevin's welfare is said to improve with institutionalization. It's reported that he now has a green Gansey and proper trousers to wear instead of the rags that he had before. He may have been ravenously hungry for chocolate roll, but so long as Chrissy can visit him, she recovers from her desperation and the grief of losing him and seems to be happy enough. The play depicts a determinedly positive ending for Chrissy, Kevin, and Bridie. So we may ask, what is Laverty up to? If Liffey Lane is an O'Casey-esque drama of social deprivation continuing into the authority of the Free State, does it twist deliberately away from O'Casey's endings of failure, abandonment, and death, such as we see in Juno and the Paycock and the Plough and the Stars? Does Laverty's choice of an upbeat conclusion that maybe aims to send the audience happily into the night, does this choice undo any impact that might lead the audience to think more about the socially sanctioned values and attitudes that underline the desperate situations and actions of the characters? In thinking about this question, I found it useful to consider how Laverty's Dublin Trilogy stands somewhat isolated from the main flow of 20th century Irish theatre, isolated in fact to the point of disappearance. And this led me to the story of Maura Laverty and Brendan Behan. Brendan Behan was an inmate in Arbor Hill prison when he wrote to Laverty telling her how he and his fellow prisoners greedily circulated her first novel, Never No More. He also wanted to borrow a copy of Alone We Embark, which was banned, as Caitriona has pointed out. Whether Behan did or didn't see the gate staging of Liffey Lane in 1951, I do not know. It is possible, however, because over that period of 1951 and to 1952, although he lived in Paris for periods during that time, he may well have visited Dublin. Behan's first breakthrough, though, in theatre was with The Quare Fellow, first staged in 1954 by the Pike Theatre in Dublin, but internationally recognised in its London staging by Joan Littlewood's Theatre Workshop in 1956. The Quare Fellow and Liffey Lane bear some fairly obvious parallels. Their large ensemble casts, interludes of choral dialogue, music and singing and music hall conventions of performance, and the non-appearance of a key character, such as Kevin in Liffey Lane, and in Behan's play, the man who's due to be executed in the prison that day. Kenneth Tynan, the highly regarded critic and brilliant writer on theatre, reviewed that London production of Beuken's play, referring to the gradual build-up towards the moment of execution, which was obviously staged off stage. Tynan wrote, quote, "The tension is unbearable, but it is we who feel it, not the people in the play." He continued, quote, "The tragedy is concealed beneath layer after layer of rough comedy." Beuken and director Joan Littlewood shared the aim of entertaining the audience and diverting them so that, and this is Beuken speaking, while they were laughing their heads off, you could be up to any bloody thing behind their backs. And it was what you were doing behind their bloody backs that made your play great. The question arising from this connection with Beuken is whether Laverty's Liffey Lane might succeed in keeping the audience entertained, while behind their backs, the play so vividly presents the misery, hurt, and vulnerability of the poor, and the victimization of women, children, and communities through a punishing and tragic overlap of patriarchal church and state power, that this is felt by the audience beneath the reassurance of happy endings. Laverty and Beuken may be amongst those playwrights who open a chink in dramatic structures that succeeds, in part at least, by indirection, and that this aspect of their plays opens in turn the space in performance to reshape the staging towards its deeper subterranean meanings. And of course, this can only be tested by contemporary performances of the three plays, so that we can see how a contemporary audience in 2021 might respond to them. Thanks very much indeed for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you, Cathy, for this wonderful talk, in which you, I think, really showed us the complexity of the dramatic techniques that Maura Laverty used. And I personally thought the comparison with Beuken here is also fascinating and something to explore, and also the way you've reflected on indeed those the church, but also material conditions and how those must have resonated, indeed behind the backs of the audience. And I can only, subscribe to your appeal for renewed productions of this. And I'm sure your publication together with Deirdre, will pave the way for that. So thanks so much for that. And that also already introduces Deirdre, who is our final panelist for today. So Deirdre McFeely received her PhD from Trinity College Dublin, where she was also teaching until recently. She's published her book on Dion Boucicault with Cambridge University Press, and currently indeed is working with Cathy on the publication of Laverty's trilogy. But I know she's also written a great chapter analysing those plays as a neat means of social commentary. And I happen to know this because I'm co-editing the book with Margriet Corporaal, who's also, I see, among our list of people present, a book called A Stage of Emancipation, Change and Progress at the Dublin Gate Theatre. That will also be published by Liverpool University Press in May, and we're very happy to announce that that will be published open access, meaning that you'll be able to read Deirdre's wonderful chapter on Laverty in there and all the other wonderful contributions that we've received. Deirdre's talk today will focus on indeed Laverty's trilogy of gate plays and how that is indeed rooted in Dublin. And perhaps a very particular aspect of Dublin, but also she will discuss influences beyond that of the city, how those are also featured into the play. So I'd like to give the floor to Deirdre for that. I think you might still be muted, Deirdre.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get my full screen here. Oh, what do I do? Hang on.
We can see you though, so that's all perfect.
Okay, you can see me. Great. I can only see you.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
Great. Okay, well, I'll fire away anyway. Thanks for that, Ruud. And thanks, Patrick, for inviting us to speak today. on Laverty. Now, Patrick, you suggested that, you know, we kind of take an informal approach, so that is definitely what I'm doing. I want to talk about my own personal response to the plays, and also on the informal approach, I decided to present from Tolka Estate, which is close enough to where I live rather than actually from my bedroom. And I'll just return to that image later on. When I first encountered the plays, two things that kind of struck me was, first, their rootedness in Dublin. And, you know, perhaps it is because I am a Dubliner that they just seem to jump off the page at me. The other thing that struck me was that I felt they stood alone from her other work. You know, that I saw them as a kind of an entity on their own. And I know while there are copies available of the plays in the Archive of Northwestern and in Galway and indeed in the National Library in Dublin, I'm mindful that there's people here today, you know, who may not be familiar with the plays. I'm also mindful that I can only talk about them as how they exist on the page, which can be frustrating. And as Cathy has said, you know, hopefully that we will get to see them in production at some stage. Now, when I started to look at Laverty, it was only the name Tolka Row that had any resonance with me. And of course, that was to do with the television series that Laverty wrote from 1964 until her untimely death in 1966. Now, given I wasn't around then, or just about, but it is an indication, I think, of how embedded, you know, the title Tolka Row is in Irish popular culture, that even I would be familiar with it, though I had never seen it. And given that Tolka Row was Ireland's first television soap, that's perhaps not surprising. The other, of course, title, I think, from her work that is fully embedded in Irish popular culture too is Full and Plenty, her 1960 cookbook that Caitrionia has already referred to, and you know, and as she showed, it doesn't actually show up with the background. And one of the things with Barbara's play, with the wonderful clip, is that a lot of people who went to the play, you know, they spoke about how their mother had a copy of that book in the kitchen. Now, because Laverty has published so much, as Caitriona has outlined, I tended to see the plays when I approached them as a very, as I've already said, totally separate from the other body of her work. And it might have perhaps been just a sense of being overwhelmed by the amount of writing that she has done. We know that Lift Up Your Gates, her fourth novel, was the inspiration for Liffey Lane, her first play. I think because it was Hilton Edwards, or what I've read, you know, is that it was Hilton Edwards who suggested that she reworked the novel as a play, because of course Edwards and MacLeamore had both read the book and enjoyed it very much, and then the fact that she only wrote the 3 plays, that I saw this as this kind of neat little entity. And of course, as already referred to, you know, she was very, you know, and we called them the Dublin Trilogy, and there's, you know, even the media at the time, you know, made those associations back to O'Casey, and it, you know, that in my mind anyway, I saw them as this, you know, standalone entity of her work, and the question as to why she stopped writing, you know, is very interesting, and people may have ideas on that. And I think it certainly links into Ruud's comments at the start about her difficulty getting paid. You know, that might be one of the reasons. Another reason I thought the plays is different from the rest of her body of work was the subject of food and cooking. Now, both of these subjects, as we know, are so central to her overall body of work, but they're mostly absent from the plays. And perhaps it's not fair to say they're absent, but it's certainly different. And what was so wonderful about Barbara's piece is that she actually cooks on stage, and obviously something that's very difficult to achieve, you know, in the professional theatre. But when I thought about it, you know, it's not that food and cooking is absent from the 3 plays, but it is very different. There is a shortage of food, there is an absence of food, there is talk about the cost of food, and Cathy has already referred to the chocolate roll in Liffey Lane, and of course, all of the action of Liffey Lane almost hinges on that chocolate roll, because Chrissy sells Sister Martha's tin can to get the money to buy the chocolate roll for Kevin, who's in the orphanage, because that's what she had promised. So it's very different to, I felt it was very different to that theme of Full and Plenty, that runs through all of her other writings, both in her novels and her cookery books, a lot of her journalism. And that notion of full and plenty that is so associated with plentitude that she depicts in the countryside. So the absence of a certain sentiment about food and the play's urban setting, in my eyes, sets them apart from her other work. But I feel that's wrong now. Now, in terms of the urban setting, the titles obviously anchor them as Dublin plays. Liffey Lane, everybody be familiar with this, you know, it's so synonymous, not just with Dublin as a city, but also with Dublin as a city of literature. Now, Laverty clearly wanted another river for her second play, and as we know from some of the scripts in the archive at Galway, she had picked Daughter Terrace, but then she subsequently changed that to Tolka, which is the river that flows through Dublin's north side. The Dodder, of course, flows through Dublin's south side. But even though she didn't use the Dodder in the title, the Dodder has a very strong presence in the plays still. Sean escapes his crowd at home regularly to fish in the Dodder at West Farnham Bridge. And one of Fintan and May's favourite walks in a tree in the Crescent is down by the Dodder and home via Donnybrook. Now, Laverty may have opted for the Tolka over the Dodder because it offered more options in terms of proximity to council-built housing. As Sadie says to Fintan in A Tree in the Crescent, would you never think of one of the new corporation houses, Fintan, in Image or Cabra? Because, of course, Cabra was hugely developed in the 1950s. And, of course, the Tolka runs so close to it. But, in effect, Tolka Road could have been in any number of locations in Dublin. As it says in the opening stage directions, it is one of 1,000 similar houses in a slum clearance scheme on the fringe of Dublin. Now, the photo that's my backdrop is the Tolka estate in Glasnevin, which is very, very close to Cabra. This particular estate was built in the late 40s and the early 50s. So Laverty may have taken just, you know, her Adea, the name, from this particular estate. But as I said, it could have been any number of those estates that are built throughout Dublin in the 1950s. And I took that photo only last Saturday. There's actually a lot of roads in that kind of part of North Dublin with Tolka in them. And it is within my 5K, so I wasn't breaking any COVID regulations. Now, when I read the play for the first time, two things that really, really struck me were almost a shock that Liffey Lane was set at the same time as Tolka Road. You know, you read Liffey Lane, and of course you can't avoid the you know, thinking of O'Casey's plays, particularly that tenement door in Liffey Lane. But, you know, they're both set in 1951. I mean, the reality is the tenements continued in Dublin long beyond 1951, but it certainly was a shock. The other thing that really struck me was how familiar aspects of the plays felt. And it would be interesting to know, you know, how other people have responded to the plays, whether it is because I know Dublin, that I responded in a particular way, or whether that kind of sense of life of the city is just as strong for people who live outside Ireland. Now, of course, it's Laverty's use of place names so repeatedly throughout the play that makes them feel so familiar to us. It's not just place names, it's cinema names, it's, you know, references to all kinds of popular culture of the day. But I think it's more than just the use of names. It's what it's I don't know, she just, for me certainly anyway, it was just, she just created a vision, or I think a sense of Dublin in the 50s. You know, the dances in the tennis clubs, Kenilworth Lawn Tennis Club that Peggy goes to, you know, it is a real tennis club, and there were dances there. The dances in the ballrooms on Parnell Square, where so many of our parents met. The absolute centrality of the cinema to the lives, and their love of fashion. Now, my mother was 16 in 1951, and she actually grew up in Cabra. So maybe that's too why there's a strong association for me. But she had 3 sisters, and, you know, when I see their photos of their young lives, it is Peggy. It is Peggy, and so maybe that's what makes it such a strong feeling for me. But I think it's within the writing and how she evokes that period of time, and particularly that Dublin period of time. As Christopher Fitzsimon said, and I think it was in the radio interview on the programme, the RTÉ documentary about Laverty, he said it was, and I think he was talking about Tolka Road, the TV series, but I think it applies equally well to the play. He said it was Irish people seeing their lives reflected back at them. and perhaps that's partly what I was saying, part of my parents' lives reflected back at me. It was certainly a working class audience for these plays that were seeing their lives reflected back at them. And we know from the press coverage from the time that Edwards and McLean worked very hard to attract new audiences to the plays, new working class audiences. You know, they sent out notices to factories, to offices, encouraging the managers to put up notices to encourage their staff to go to the theatre. Of course, there was huge debate and fear at the time about theatre losing audiences to cinema, which they were. And their technique worked. They did attract huge, new, young working class audiences to the theatre, and they were lauded for attracting new audiences. In addition to seeing their lives reflected back to them, I think the plays were highly topical. And well, I have written about the whole contraceptive in the Talca Road, which I find absolutely fascinating. It wasn't just that, the plays are permeated with the issues that people would have been reading in the newspapers every day. In early 1951, the main topics in the newspapers were about house building. 4,000 houses were to be built in the city that year alone, something we could only dream of today. Slum clearance inquiries, TB and poverty, the mother and child health scheme, which eventually brought Noel Brown down. So for me, that these rooted these plays in a particularly Dublin culture. But to try and move on from that idea, Sean Fuelon wrote the preface to Never No More, Laverty's first novel, and he considered the pleasure he has derived from reading it. He writes, "Perhaps my delight was the result of a mere association of ideas, because I also had spent some of the happiest days of my childhood beside the Liffey at Newbridge, and on that great Curragh of Kildare, or wandering the same silent fronded canal by Monasterevin." Now, Ballyderrig, which is the small town in Never No More, of course, is Rathangan, the fictitious version of Rathangan, where Laverty grew up. And Newbridge, referred to by O'Fuelon, is very close by, situated on the Liffey, and it's their nearest big town. In the book, Delia Scully describes, going into Newbridge in the Ponion Trap to buy her first party dress. And bridges, anyone who's read her novels, there's a lot of bridges and in these books. And of course, Rathangan is located close to the Liffey, but it's actually on the Grand Canal. So as Laverty left Rathangan and came to Dublin via a number of years in Spain, so did Rita Nolan, the mother in Talca Road. Rita grew up in Ballyderrig, but obviously then moved to Dublin and married and settled. Rita's father, Dan Dempsey, played to great accolade by Micheál MacLean, worked on a barge on the Grand Canal. And when his barge came to Dublin, he berthed at Portobello, which is, of course, just around the corner from Clonbrazil Street, which was where Rita lived in her so-called tenement home before moving out to Talca Road. Now, Dan always brought something nourishing from the countryside, chicken or a few eggs or a bag of apples for the children. And again, it's this food thing that the food can only come from the country to the city. It's almost as if the city doesn't have any food of their own. With old age, Dan gives up his cottage in Ballyderrig and moves to Dublin to live with Reddy. And he's very happy to do this. And he's very happy ensconced, at the heart of their family life, small and all as the house is. He often reminisces about his life on the canal. And spoiler alert here for anybody who hasn't read the play, but Dan dies by drowning in the canal in Dublin. So to be honest, I would have first totally overlooked the canal in the play, but I actually think it's really, really central to it. And just to go back to Dan and this notion of food, when he's considering a holiday back to Ballyderrig, his description is no place to touch it in the autumn, the leaves turning in Doran's wood and the smell of the ripe blackberries, something you'd read about, hazelnuts falling out of their hulls like rain along the bog road, and a grand feeling of full and plenty everywhere, with the turf being clamped and potatoes pitted and the barley and wheat and oats being trashed. Now this could come straight from one of her novels. It links back to that full and plenty of the countryside that she portrays all the time. But to return to that notion of the canal, as I said, I think it's very central. In Never No More, Delia's aunt drowns at the age of 6 in the canal. And actually this sadly reflects Laverty's own life, as one of her sisters drowned in the canal as a child. Now, the canal, Caitriona mentioned A Cottage in the Bog, Laverty's first novel for children. The canal is also really central in this. Very briefly, the story features three children whose Uncle Pat is a skipper of the barge, like Dan Dempsey, Rita's father. They live near Rathangan, and again, so it's the Grand Canal, like Dan's Canal. As in Tá Corona, this is written in 1945, so it predates her, well predates her plays. But like Tá Corona, their house is small, even though it is in the countryside, and it has to accommodate 3 generations, including Uncle Pat and the grandfather. So where in Tá Corona they have Stacia, the aunt, here it's Uncle Pat. Now, one of the children, Essie, slept in the parlour in a special bed that every morning became a chair. And of course, this is shown in Tá Corona. Now, the children get to take a wonderful trip to Dublin on their Uncle Pat's barge, and they stay with their aunt in Whitechurch, which was then on the edge of Dublin, just beyond Rathfarnham. Now, of course, Whitechurch is hugely significant in Liffey Lane, and of course in Lift Up Your Gates, the novel. The children in the story, the children in The Cottage in the Bog, they come from the country to stay in Whitechurch, and from there they visit the sites of the city. Now, Chrissy Doyle lives among those sites of the city, and I'm just thinking of, I know Cathy has written on this, I think is a Tony Inglis's backdrop for the production In the Gate, where he depicted different sites from the city as part of the background. But Chrissy lives among those sites, but she would never have had the money to visit the zoo or go up Nelson's Pillar as the children in the story do. But she dreams of going to Whitechurch. You know, she stares at the Whitechurch, but so much that Nanny Buckley thinks she fancies the bus conductor. And Chrissy says, it goes to Whitechurch. Someday I'm going there. I'm getting on that bus and I'm going out to the country. Now, the Whitechurch represents Chrissy's hopes and dreams. And she runs away when everything goes wrong for her, and she sells the tin can to buy the chocolate roll. She runs away to this, what she thinks is this rural idyll Whitechurch. Of course, Chrissy thinks it is a church that is white, but of course there was no church. It is just a location called Whitechurch. Now, in The Cottage in the Bog, the children's journey from rural to urban, you know, is joyful. But their visit to Dublin is only temporary, and you know, they return home. In Laverty's second novel, Alone We Embark, 1943, Mary Sheehy moves from Tullinolan, which is another fictitious name for Rathangan, to Dublin after marriage, but is not a happy experience. Now, she lives in rented accommodation beside the North Strand, and it's actually beside the quota. As she says in the book, Talca Bridge spanned a small river that dried up several times during the summer months. And of course, then the smell is terrible. And she said, to Mary, fresh from Tullinolan, with its bog-sweetened breezes, the smells around the North Strand were a real trial. She never got used to them. So again, now eventually Mary's husband dies of TB in Dublin, and she's able to escape back to Tullinolan with her child. But I just thought it was interesting that the Talca was presenting, you know, even in her earlier fiction. And in A Tree in the Crescent, Fintan, when Fintan's wife is away and Fintan meets his old girlfriend, of course it's on the Leixlip Road where they can walk by the Liffey. And in the prologue to Liffey Lane, Mrs. Doyle proclaims, rivers is it, rivers is right, rivers of sorrow. That's all I've known since the day I married. And she returns to this theme again in the play. So all really I'm trying to suggest is that where I would have originally seen the plays as quite static, particularly given the 2 domestic settings of the second 2 plays, I think there is a huge flow and movement within Laverty's work, flowing from the rural to the urban, from the urban to the less urban or the suburban. And emigration, I think, too, is always there as movement, just on the fringes. Nanny Buckley in Liffey Lane is going to go and work in a factory in England. Eileen has gone to Liverpool but returns. And I think, and just to finish, I think all this movement can be seen in Laverty's own life. In Kind Cooking, you know, she moved around an awful lot. And, you know, she says in Kind Cooking, the Dublin kitchen in which I made my debut as a married cook was pretty bad. We had 2 furnished rooms and the use of the kitchen. And she goes on to say that since then I've had 7 kitchens. And she continues that this is because life has always been full of surprises for my family. It has prevented us from staying put for more than a couple of years at a time. So she was constantly on the move in and always in rented accommodation, which I presume probably wouldn't have been that unusual at the time. Her different addresses, I think, show up in her work. Fitzwilliam Lane, when she lived in a mews house, is for Liffey Lane. In her many years in Leinster Road, for Rathmines Crescent, in a tree in the Crescent. And in a tree in the Crescent, May and Fintan always aspire to buying their own home, because they live in a flat, they rent. And they hope to live in the Nath Road, Dundrum, Mount Merion at different times. Their final choice is Rathfarnham. Now, Fintan doesn't live to ever move and live in Rathfarnham. But unlike Fintan, Laverty was able to do so. She moved to Rathfarnham in 1965 to 30 Butterfield Drive. I would imagine it was the security of income from writing the TV scripts that enabled her to finally buy her own home. Butterfield Drive in Rathfarnham is right beside the Dodder. And unfortunately, Laverty died in 1966, only a year after she moved into her house. She was brought back over the city for burial in Glasnevin Cemetery. So perhaps it was only fitting, because of course, Glasnevin Cemetery is on the Tolka. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deirdre, for that wonderful entwining of Maura Laverty's own life and her works and plays, and how those intersect, and especially drawing our attention to things that might not strike us at first in a place like that, all the references to food and food shortages and all the things you explained, and which become quite a dominant theme if you look at it in that way. So thanks so much for that. What we'll be doing next is to open up the chat for questions. I see one coming in already, so that is absolutely fabulous. I'd say there are two strategies, one of which is already being used, namely to formulate your question in the chat and ask it there, and I'll relay it to the presenters. The other is simply to state your name in the chat, and then I'll give the floor to you, so you can ask it via mic if that's what you prefer. That's perfectly fine as well. But we have a first question coming in already from Ewan Zimmerman, who says, to Deirdre, as a foreigner who spent a year in the city, I certainly felt the rootedness in Dublin, in Liffey Lane and a tree in the Crescent, with a great sense of place and community, but much less in Tolka Row, which I feel isolates its characters from Dublin, because we only ever see the inside of the house and the fence on stage, and the characters are punished as they go out. It feels like they're alienated from the city. So, Deirdre, what would be your take on that?
Yeah, hi Ewan, who's in Paris and who's doing wonderful work on Laverty. Yeah, that's actually a really good point. And Liffey Lane, I've thought of it recently, because with COVID, we're trying to live our lives outdoors, and in Liffey Lane, they do live their lives on the street, and that allows, of course, for this wonderful setting. Particularly, life is it's out the window, she's shouting out the window, things like that, but life is on the street, and equally, yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I've always thought of just the women being kind of constricted in terms of the domestic space. But even in Tolka Row, and of course it is Sean who escapes, he has to go fishing in Rathfarnham to escape that crowded house. So that's a really interesting point. And I suppose it's her so many uses of place names, cinema names, etc. in Tolka Row, probably more so than in the other two plays, that I would have considered as more Dublin. But that's a really interesting point. Thanks, Ewan.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I see another question coming in just now, I think. GP McMahon says, Maura Laverty's books were important for writing my Irish cookbook published this year, and my PhD is on staging food, so interesting to see how food appears in the play. So I think you've, Deirdre, already drawn extra attention to that for JP, which will no doubt be helpful there. So thanks very much for that comment. Anyone else who might want to ask a question can either enter your name or formulate. Oh, there we have Ian jumping into the conversation. Thank you, Katrina, Cathy and Deirdre, for such a fascinating panel. Did Laverty have any connection to Irish Housewives Association, which was started in part by Hilda Tweedy after seeing Robert Collis's Marrowbone Lane at the Gate, and which was also about dire living conditions of Dublin's poor? Or might you have seen Collis's play revived a few times in the 1940s and led to the Marrowbone Lane Fund for the poor and those with tuberculosis? So Cathy or Katrina or Deirdre, would you happen to have any? Yeah, Katrina, go right ahead.
I think Laverty, there were an awful lot of culture, of plays and novels and sort of writings that came out in the 1940s about the Dublin slums, believe it or not. Laverty always maintained that Lift Up Your Gates was banned because it was too frank about the poverty, but I don't think it was, because there were other books that came out around the same time that were frank about the poverty too. The Irish Housewives Association was very much an upper middle class organisation in Dublin. They were a really good group of women. They drew attention to consumer affairs and so on. I think Laverty was more, she probably would have been too busy maybe to get involved with them. They were they were women like who were really, they drew attention to the quality of milk and all things like that. And they supported the mother and child and everything. But I don't think Laverty had any connection with them. At least I've never come across it. She may have praised them. She may have interviewed them in one of her many, many, many newspaper columns, but I don't think she was a member. I don't know. Has anyone else anything to say about that?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Perhaps Cathy, I don't know if you also want to weigh in on this question.
No, I don't have any information about whether she was a member or not. I think Caitriona's the expert in those matters. And something about, just to add to the really interesting response that Deirdre had about the first question, which was, gosh, I've kind of lost my train of thought.
The outdoor space, Cathy.
Yeah.
The outdoor space, yeah. Yes, thank you very much, Deirdre. It's I think a common experience that the people who lived in the tenement buildings in the central city, they really found it a massive disruption in every way, personally and in terms of their community as well, to move into those confined spaces of a closely built suburb, which we see now behind your image. Well, I can see it anyway, where each house was separated from the next house. And I think that in Talcarrow, Laverty makes that part of the scene of the play, because she actually she has represented on stage two households. Mm-hmm. One occupied by Mrs. Feeney and her family and a huge number of children, and the other occupied by this extended family. And the part of the comedy, but is it only comedy, of the action of the play is Mrs. Feeney climbing over the metal railing that separates the two houses, which becomes a kind of comical image of those women's efforts to overcome that sense of isolation. I guess the isolation, which was one of the main attractions of having that really close community cooperation that they shared in the tenement, where you would borrow money, you would borrow milk, you would borrow sugar from your neighbors in a quid pro quo basis. And the women particularly would cooperate with one another hugely. And there was an incredible kind of generosity as well, which we also see in the play in Liffey Lane. When Lar wins money on his gambling, he doesn't keep it for himself. He doesn't put it in the credit union or whatever. He spends it all giving all his neighbors a party. So you know, that was part of the benefit of that kind of close-knit community. Laverty also dramatizes the disadvantages of that closeness in a very telling way as well.
Yeah, that's, I think, a great point. And again, something that I saw resonating, I think, in all of your talks is those tensions, indeed, that she very much explores. That on the one hand, you have that element of sympathy that you're describing here, but also the kind of limitations that this enforces on people, and indeed proximity, which can be both rewarding but also problematic in that regard. I see David Clare coming in with a question as well for Caitriona. He says, like Teresa Deevy and Kate O'Brien, Laverty had exposure to continental and or British Catholicism. Do you think that she, like them, was a believer who wanted to see Irish Catholicism become more continental, and hence their scathing treatments of the church and state's views and policies regarding women and sexuality? That's an interesting question. Caitriona?
Yes, I think her time in Spain was definitely decisive in that. Another writer who spent time on the continent in Southern Europe was Alice Cortain, who was a very much a Catholic writer, and she wrote biographies of Teresa, of Catherine of Siena, and she wrote a book of saints that we might all remember. But in her novel, she kind of argues for the more sensual Catholicism of Italy, for example, and a girl in a heroine in one of her novels won't get married because she doesn't say it right out, but the whole notion of sex seems to be off-putting to her or something, and Cortain deplores this. I think Laverty, a little bit like Kate O'Brien, I always think No More Than Human is sort of a comic counterpoint to Mary Lavelle, Kate O'Brien's lovely romantic story about going to Spain. And I think that the wider experience of Catholicism made them come back and maybe question Irish Catholicism a little bit. Because when you think about, Laverty's books, her banned books, they only offended Irish Catholicism. They were, as I said, they were rapturously reviewed in Catholic publications in America, in Australia, and in Britain. So yeah, I think you're right. I think that the continental experience, but it could have been also the kind of people they were too. They were sort of that Laverty was. I think she was a very open-hearted sort of a woman who liked to live life to the full, and that's, Cathy was talking there about the happy end, the happy ending in Liffey Lane. Although we know there weren't happy endings in real life for a lot of unmarried mothers and for a lot of children who went to industrial schools. I think Laverty really wanted unmarried mothers and their children to have happy endings. I think it was kind of an imagined world. Even Never No More is full of people who transgress, but who are pardoned, like the woman who gets married and has a baby after 6 months, and the doctor says, "Oh, your wife is a grand, quick woman." I have never seen any other woman able to manage pregnancy as quickly. And of course, she's pregnant by another man, but the whole village is sniggering about it. That kind of thing. Anyway, yeah, that's definitely the continental influence there.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Caitriona. I see Joan Dean also with a question. Says, thanks for a wonderful view of two of the Gate's most popular plays. As Ruud noted, I noted, Laverty's plays eventually saved the Gate in the early 1950s. So is it fair to assume that her audiences weren't typical Gate audiences? And would any of you perhaps have suggestions about the play's success outside of Dublin? Did it tour as well? Anyone, if you'd like to comment on that, Cathy?
Well, I think just the capacity of the Gaiety Theatre tells you that it wasn't only a Gate audience, perhaps, but it was a much wider audience. And what Deirdre's already mentioned about the publicity campaign in preparation for the productions, it's interesting that one of the productions in that programme at the Gaiety was Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, which again was a play that was so talked about in that period that it would have drawn a very wide audience. Whereas perhaps if it had been at the Gate, it would have been, it's interesting how the location of the theatre, in fact, defines an audience in a particular way, so that, there is a kind of play that you can stage at the Gate and nobody will be upset, or stage at the Project Art Centre nowadays that nobody will bother about. But if you put it on the Abbey stage, you will find that people are up in arms and, talking about a collapse of national standards, etc. So I can imagine that the audience was very unusual, and that unusually wide in its reach, I suppose. Yeah.
I think too, given the number of Dublin revivals, it strikes me too that I think it's a play that people would have returned to. Not just seen it once, but it was a play. Her work were a play that people came back to. I don't think it was I think it did tour to Cork, but I don't think it was extensively toured. And I think where the interest possibly in other productions' lives would be in terms of the number of amateur productions that were staged. It was Talca Row was the most popular one to be staged, and I mean you can see for staging reasons, and going back to the point Ewan made, that because it is kind of so confined, it would appeal to amateur production companies. But I think given the and I think that's really interesting given the content in the play, about the discussion about the rhythm method, that it would be interesting to know if that was cut from any amateur productions. I know it was cut from radio productions that was done, and from the BBC film in which Miall MacLean was starred. So I think I think the amateur production of Talca Row around the country is certainly something that somebody could be interested in looking at.
Fully agree with that, and indeed in terms of touring of the play, indeed I think it toured to Limerick and Belfast, but was also performed in the UK and the US, at least at the time, but has since of course been less prominent, but still has that kind of popularity among amateur dramatic groups. It's also, I think, an interesting contrast, also perhaps something that we saw in the video by Bairbre, where I think one of the people who responded to the production said, well, it'll be different from people from the city and people living in the countryside, how they perceive Maura Laverty. So I thought there was also an interesting kind of tension there, and perhaps one that we can partially at least map also into issues of professional and amateur groups. So I was wondering if we are thinking indeed about reviving Maura Laverty, which I think everyone here will be very much in favour of. Are there particular resonances or potentials that you see in any kind of specific avenues that you'd like directors to explore?
I think Cathy, you should respond to that.
Well, Deirdre and I have talked about this, and there's nothing we'd like better than to see as any of the three plays staged. I suppose that what's really extraordinary is the statistic that Deirdre gave of the number of corporation houses built in Dublin in 1951. Where there was a social policy that housing was a human right, as it were. I mean, the irony of women stuck in a tenement building, as they were in Liffey Lane, was that they could not fulfill the position of women as defined in the 1937 Constitution. They could not mind their families because they simply did not have the resources to do so in that level of housing. And so the question of housing, which is so much on the agenda again here, seems to be a way into the plays. How exactly that might be staged is another issue, which you'd have to talk to directors about. But I do feel that there's a tremendous amount of relevance, particularly in Talca Row and in Liffey Lane, in relation to our coming to terms also with the past in Ireland, that we have to acknowledge. And perhaps Laverty dramatizes in some way how Irish people tiptoed around the difficult aspects of their lives, particularly women, the aspects of women's lives that were so subject to control during an earlier period in our history, that we have to get to grips with that. And I think the final report of the Commission of Inquiry into Mother and Baby Homes throws down the gauntlet that we have to articulate and face up to. The responsibility of the state, the responsibility of the religious orders, but also individual responsibility for allowing those things to happen and that set of values to dominate. So I'll get off my soapbox now.
No, but I think that's actually a very important statement to make, and also I think a very good statement to kind of connect both the reflection on the past that we've been making, but also pointing forward and finding the connections between what Maura Laverty showed her about showed us still about her age and how that can still impact the future still. So also with a clock, or with an eye on the clock, I think perhaps it would be a very good statement on your soapbox to round off a wonderful discussion that we had. And in doing so, I'd very much like to echo Aideen Howard's comment there to thank Cathy, Deirdre and Caitrionia for very lively insight into the work. I think you very much provided that, so thanks so much for that. Before you log off, two things that I'd briefly like to mention. The most important of which is definitely that we have a final and very prominent final piece to today's aspect of the conference coming up, namely the keynote by Joan Fitzpatrick-Dean, who's also here in the session. I'm just quickly looking at the title again. That's Getting Known Brecht and the Brechtchen in Ireland. That will be at 5 p.m. So you are very much invited using the same link to attend that session as well. I know Joan to be a wonderful speaker and a wonderful scholar, so I'm very keen to hear her speak in a bit myself. The other minor thing is that I thought I'd just share the link once again to the Radboud University website dedicated to our research network, and specifically to the page where the scholarship is listed, which is far from complete. So this is also a very kind invitation to anyone who wants to contribute to this to send me an email. That would be @let.ru.nl. If you have materials that you would like to see added there, just send them to me and I'll make sure they get added in due time. And this is, by the way, the main page of the network where you can find lots and lots of information. So that I just wanted to share. I hope to see all of you in a little bit for Joan Fitzpatrick-Dean's talk. Thanks again to Deirdre, Caitrionia, Cathy for your wonderful talks, and hopefully we'll see each other very shortly again. So,
thanks very much. Thanks.
Yes.
Bye all.
Thanks to all.